Imagine waking up inside your own home and watching your breath hang in the air like fog. The water in the basin beside your bed has frozen solid. Your children are huddled together under every blanket you own, still shivering. This was not a disaster. This was not an emergency. This was just Tuesday in January. And it stayed that way for most of American history. In 1856, a minister in Vermont wrote a letter to his brother describing what January looked like inside his home. The water in his washbasin had frozen solid overnight. The ink on his desk had turned to black ice in the well. His children slept in wool caps, huddled together in the one room where the fireplace still held embers. That was not unusual. That was simply winter, at least. That is what everyone believed at the time. How does a country go from families freezing inside their own homes to people throwing their apartment windows open in February because the heat is unbearable? The answer starts with a fireplace that barely worked. In the 1700s, the standard American home was built for summer. That is not an exaggeration. An English visitor to upstate New York in 1827 wrote that American houses were constructed, in his words, without the slightest reference to the 6 months of winter that the people suffered through. Walls were thin. Gaps ran along floorboards and window frames. Insulation, in any modern sense, was non-existent. What colonists had was a fireplace, sometimes one, and sometimes, if the family had money, one at each end of the house. And fireplaces were genuinely terrible at their job. A fireplace operates at roughly 10 to 20% efficiency. That means for every 10 logs you burn, the heat from 8 or 9 of them goes straight up the chimney. Worse, as hot air rises and escapes, it creates a vacuum effect that actively pulls cold air into the house, through every crack and gap in the walls. The fire that was supposed to warm you was simultaneously making the rest of your home colder. If you were sitting directly in front of the hearth, you might be comfortable. 3 feet away, the temperature dropped sharply. Across the room, it could be near freezing. Colonial families responded to this by abandoning most of their house during winter. The formal dining room stayed shut. Bedrooms went unheated unless you were wealthy enough to have servants tending fires throughout. The family retreated to a single space called the keeping room, the one room closest to the main hearth, where cooking, eating, working, and sleeping all happened within arm's reach of the flames. The keeping room was the heart of a colonial home, not in some cozy, romantic sense, but as a survival decision. Mothers cooked over the same fire that warmed the children. Fathers mended tools by firelight. At night, the family arranged themselves on the floor or on narrow beds around the hearth, the youngest closest to the warmth, the oldest furthest away. Privacy vanished in winter. So did personal space. You slept in your clothes under wool blankets, often wearing a knit cap to keep heat from escaping through your head. Even in prosperous homes, the experience was grim. A Virginia plantation house, with fireplaces at both ends, still left the hallway cold enough to see your breath. The governor's mansion in Williamsburg burned through enormous quantities of wood just to keep a few main rooms livable. Cold was the baseline, warmth was the exception, and the mornings were brutal. When temperatures dropped to single digits, families woke to frozen eggs, frozen milk, and frozen jars of preserves. Bread dough would not rise, pens would not write, fruits left in pantries turned to solid ice. The fire needed feeding every few hours through the night, which meant someone had to wake in the freezing dark to stoke it, or everyone would wake up colder than when they fell asleep. The solution Americans came up with was logical. It was also completely unsustainable. The obvious answer was to burn more wood, and that is exactly what they did, in quantities that sound almost fictional today. The typical family in the late 1700s burned through 18 to 20 cords of firewood every year. One cord is a stack 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long. 20 cords is an almost incomprehensible volume of wood, and obtaining it was nearly a full-time job. Trees had to be felled, dragged, split, dried, and stacked. In the coldest months, when fuel demand was highest, the labor of keeping the fire going consumed entire days. A man chopping and splitting wood burned enormous amounts of energy, and in winter, calories were already scarce. If you stopped cutting, you stopped heating. There was no reserve system, no utility company, no backup. Your woodpile was your lifeline, and watching it shrink through January was its own kind of dread. Here is the part nobody expects. The colonies had begun with an almost absurd abundance of forest. Early settlers described woodlands so dense and vast that the idea of running out seemed laughable. But colonists burned through timber with no thought of conservation, using enormous fireplaces with wide-open hearths that consumed fuel at a staggering rate. By the mid-1700s, the crisis was severe in cities like Philadelphia and Boston, where forests had been pushed back so far from population centers that the cost of hauling wood made it unaffordable for the poor. America's first energy crisis was not oil, it was wood. The wealthy could pay for delivery and stockpile cords before the first frost. The poor could not. Families in crowded city neighborhoods burned scraps, furniture, fencing, anything that would catch fire. Some burned so little that their homes barely rose above the outside temperature. A physician in Philadelphia observed at the time that the poor froze simply because they could not afford to buy wood. Nobody was treating that as a systemic failure yet. The cold was still considered an act of nature, not a consequence of economics. One person who did treat it as a solvable problem was Benjamin Franklin. He lived in Philadelphia, where the wood shortage was worsening every year, and house fires caused by open hearths were killing families with grim regularity. In 1742, he designed what he called the Pennsylvania fireplace, a cast-iron box that fit inside an existing fireplace and used a hollow baffle system to radiate more heat into the room instead of sending it up the chimney. The iron walls absorbed heat and radiated it outward in all directions. The metal held warmth long after the fire burned low, meaning a room could stay tolerably warm between stoking. Franklin estimated his design could produce the same amount of heat as a conventional fireplace while using roughly a quarter of the wood. For a country running out of trees, that was an extraordinary promise. Franklin refused to patent it, believing useful inventions should be shared freely. That generosity was noble and also fortunate, because the original design had a serious flaw. The inverted siphon at the base of the stove was supposed to draw hot gases downward before venting them, but because smoke naturally rises, the draft never worked properly. The stove smoked badly, filled rooms with haze, and sold poorly. It took nearly 40 years for an inventor named David Rittenhouse to fix the problem by adding an L-shaped flue that worked with the natural direction of smoke rather than against it. That improvement finally made the concept practical, but by then, America's fuel landscape was already shifting beneath it. Coal was becoming the answer to the wood crisis. It burned hotter, lasted longer, and did not require chopping down entire forests. Deposits had been found across Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Appalachian Range. By the early 1800s, cast iron stoves designed specifically for coal were appearing in homes across the Northeast. A coal stove could be placed in the center of a room. It could heat more than just the person sitting directly in front of it. The iron body stored heat and released it steadily. For the first time, families could spread out during winter. A second room became usable. A hallway did not have to feel like walking into a meat locker. Children could sleep in a separate space from their parents without risking frostbite. That was progress. But coal carried its own cost, paid in human bodies. Cave-ins crushed men underground. Explosions tore through mine shafts without warning. Miners who survived the physical collapses often did not survive the dust, developing lung diseases that slowly suffocated them over years. Above ground, burning coal-coated cities in soot and sulfur. The air in industrial Philadelphia and Pittsburgh turned thick and gray. The fuel that saved Americans from freezing was slowly poisoning the air they breathed. In 1855, Franz Sangalli, a Russian-born engineer working in St. Petersburg, invented the modern cast-iron radiator. The concept was elegant: a coal-fired boiler in a basement heated water or produced steam, which traveled through pipes to cast-iron radiators placed in individual rooms. Each radiator released heat steadily and evenly. For the first time in human history, every room in a house could be warm simultaneously. Wealthy families in cities like New York and Boston installed radiator systems in the 1860s and 70s. Everyone else kept burning stoves and waiting. The single event that accelerated central heating faster than any invention was something nobody saw coming: a pandemic. In 1918, the influenza pandemic swept across the globe, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide. There was no vaccine, no antiviral medication. The only public health guidance that seemed to help was ventilation. Open the windows. Let fresh air circulate. Get the stale, contaminated indoor air out. The problem was devastating in its simplicity. Opening your windows in January in New York, Boston, or Chicago meant freezing. The very act that might protect you from influenza could kill you from exposure. Engineers responded by designing radiator systems that were intentionally oversized. The new standard was blunt and extreme. A building's heating system should be capable of keeping every room warm on the coldest day of the year, with every window wide open. Radiators were placed directly beneath windows so that cold air flowing in through the sashes would be heated immediately upon entering the room. The design was not about comfort. It was pandemic defense. Once the pandemic passed and modern medicine offered better tools, people forgot why their radiators ran so hot. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, families closed their windows because they could not afford the coal to replace the heat that escaped. The rooms became unbearably hot, and nobody remembered that the heat was supposed to escape. Subsequent generations complained about overheated apartments, cranking windows open in February to cool down rooms that felt like saunas. They had no idea they were doing exactly what the system was designed for. If you have ever lived in an older apartment in a northern city and thrown your window open in the dead of winter because the radiator was unbearable, you were not experiencing a defect. You were experiencing a 100-year-old pandemic survival strategy still running exactly as intended. Central heating did not just change the temperature inside American homes. It redesigned the homes themselves and reshaped nearly every aspect of daily life. Before reliable heating, architecture was dictated by cold. Rooms were small because smaller spaces were easier to warm. Ceilings were low because heat rises. Hallways were narrow to reduce drafts. Bedrooms were placed upstairs not for privacy, but because heat from the ground floor drifted up, making the second story marginally less miserable. Floor plans were not designed around lifestyle. They were designed around survival. Central heating dissolved all of that. Architects gained freedom they had never previously had. Rooms could spread out. Bedrooms could be placed far from the kitchen without condemning their occupants to frostbite. The open floor plan, which feels like a thoroughly modern invention, was only possible because forced air systems could distribute heat evenly across large shared spaces. Without central heating, an open floor plan is simply a very expensive way to be cold. Clothing changed too. Before central heating, people wore heavy wool indoors all winter. Multiple layers, thick stockings, shawls, and caps as standard inside the house. Once homes could be maintained at a stable temperature, indoor clothing became lighter and more varied. The modern expectation of walking around your house in a t-shirt in January would have struck anyone before 1920 as either extraordinarily wealthy or completely unhinged. And then there was bundling, the courtship practice where young couples shared a bed, fully clothed, sometimes with a wooden board placed down the middle, because heating a parlor for an evening visit burned fuel the family could not afford to waste. Central heating killed it. Once you could warm a sitting room without depleting your winter fuel supply, the practical justification for putting courting couples in bed together vanished. Romance moved to heated parlors, then to heated restaurants, then to heated theaters. The entire geography of courtship shifted because warmth was no longer scarce. By the mid-20th century, the expectation of 72 degrees indoors had become so deeply embedded in American culture that it felt like a natural right rather than a recent invention. Thermostats were standard. Furnaces were invisible. The entire infrastructure of warmth had been pushed behind walls and beneath floors, out of sight and out of mind. That comfortable forgetting came with a price tag nobody was reading. Coal gave way to oil. Oil gave way to natural gas. Each transition brought its own dependencies, its own vulnerabilities, its own environmental costs. And the oldest problem in this story, the one from colonial Philadelphia, never actually closed. It simply changed fuels. As of 2026, millions of American households still experience what energy researchers call heating insecurity, where families cannot afford to maintain a safe indoor temperature through winter. The gap that opened between those who could buy wood and those who could not has persisted across 3 centuries and half a dozen different fuels. Every few years, a winter storm reminds us how thin the margin still is. When the power goes out and the furnace stops and the temperature inside begins dropping toward the temperature outside, modern people find themselves doing exactly what their ancestors did, pulling on every layer of clothing they own, gathering in one room, sleeping close together for warmth, watching their breath hang in the air inside their own homes. In 1856, a minister in Vermont described that scene in a letter to his brother. In 2021, families in Texas lived it during a catastrophic grid failure that left millions without heat for days. People burned furniture in fireplaces that had not been used in decades. They slept in cars with the engine running. They filled bathtubs with water before the pipes froze and burst. The technology changed. The cold did not. The only real difference is that we forgot what it feels like. And every time the power goes out, we remember.